The coach looked across the banquet table at my grandfather and said, "Say that again, old man. I want everyone to hear how you talk." He dragged out the vowels, mocking the accent, and the parents at my grandson's football team dinner laughed because the coach was laughing and no one wanted to be on the wrong side of the joke. My grandfather set down his fork. He smiled. 2 tables over, the president of the Football Federation was already rising from his chair. My grandfather came to this country 35 years ago. He learned the language by reading newspapers out loud in a kitchen that smelled like bread and regret. He never lost the accent that marked him as an outsider. At that banquet, the coach saw an old man who spoke funny, an easy target. But my grandfather once spent a decade inside the highest levels of international football, shaping the tactics of a national youth program. The president of the federation knew that. And the moment he stood up, the entire room was about to learn the difference between how a man sounds and who he actually is. The president stood, and the room went quiet, but my grandfather raised one hand just slightly, and the man stopped mid-stride. I had never seen anyone command a room like that with so little motion. The coach didn't notice. He was still grinning, scanning the parents' tables for approval, the way men do when they've landed a punch and want to make sure the crowd saw it. But the president saw my grandfather's hand, and he sat back down. Let me tell you who my grandfather actually is. His name is Victor. In 1987, he was 44 years old and living in a country most people in this banquet hall couldn't find on a map. He had already spent 15 years coaching youth academies, working with boys who had nothing but talent and hunger. The National Federation came to him with a problem. Their under-17 team had failed to qualify for 3 consecutive tournaments, and the talent pipeline was broken. They didn't need a famous coach. They needed someone who understood how to build a system from dirt. They hired Victor as a technical consultant, and over the next 9 years, he rebuilt their entire youth development structure. He designed training protocols, scouting networks, tactical frameworks. Players who came through his system went on to play in the Bundesliga, Serie A, the Premier League. One of them captained his national team in a World Cup quarterfinal. I didn't know any of this when I was 12. I knew my grandfather as the man who picked me up from school on Tuesdays, who spoke with an accent that kids at the playground mimicked, who wore the same dark green polo shirt every Thursday because he said a good shirt didn't need replacing until it had holes. He came to every one of my matches, stood at the sideline with his arms folded, never shouting instructions like the other fathers and grandfathers. Sometimes he would make a small note in a leather-bound book he kept in his jacket pocket. I never asked what he was writing. The coach of my team that season was a man named Rick Bowman. He had played some semi-professional ball in his 20s, enough to believe he understood the game at a level no one else in town could touch. He was loud in the way insecure men are loud, always performing expertise rather than demonstrating it. He favored his own son at striker, even when the kid missed sitters that cost us matches. He told jokes at practice that felt like tests, and if you didn't laugh, you failed them. The parents loved him or feared him, which to Rick was the same thing. The banquet was held at the Greenfield Athletic Club, a low building with a banquet hall that smelled like carpet cleaner and chicken stock. It was the end of the fall season. We had finished 4th in the league, which was about right for our talent level, but Rick had spent the entire car ride over telling his assistants that the refs had stolen 3 wins from us. My parents sat at a table near the back. My grandfather sat beside them, wearing his beige blazer over that green polo, a combination I had seen 100 times. He looked like a man who had dressed for a different event entirely, something quieter and more dignified than a youth football banquet. Federation president was at the next table. His name was Emilio Reyes. He had held the position for 6 years, overseeing youth leagues, referee assignments, coaching certifications. He was at the banquet because his grandson played on the opposing team in the league, and he had been invited as a courtesy. He sat alone, nursing a glass of red wine, scrolling through his phone during the salad course. None of the parents recognized him. Rick had no idea who was sitting 12 feet away. The toast is where things started. Rick stood up, clinked his glass with a butter knife, and began a rambling speech about the season, about adversity, about how these boys had learned what real commitment looked like. He was working the room, pointing at certain parents and making inside jokes that only his favorites understood. Then his eyes landed on my grandfather. "You must be Lucas's granddad," he said, loud enough for every table to hear. "I've seen you at the matches. You just stand there. You never yell. You must be the quiet type, huh? Or maybe you just don't understand what's happening on the field." A few parents chuckled. Rick fed on it. He leaned forward, miming a confused squint. "What do you think of our football, sir? You follow the game where you're from, or do they even play it there?" My grandfather didn't answer immediately. He held Rick's gaze and smiled, the same small smile he gave telemarketers who called during dinner. He said, "I follow the game, yes." And then Rick did the thing that made my stomach drop. He repeated my grandfather's words back to him, stretching the vowels, exaggerating the accent, turning a simple sentence into a cartoon. "I follow Z game, yes." The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. My father stared at his plate. My mother's hand tightened around her napkin. I wanted to disappear into the carpet. Rick wasn't finished. He took a step closer to our table. "No disrespect, sir. I'm just playing with you, but maybe next season you can help me coach. You can teach the boys a few things from the old country." He winked at the room, "Assuming you know more than how to stand there looking confused." That was the moment Emilio Reyes set down his wine glass. He had stopped scrolling through his phone. He was watching Rick with the expression of a man who has just realized he is about to watch someone make a very expensive mistake. He recognized my grandfather, not from the banquet, not from the sideline, from 15 years earlier at a coaching symposium in Zurich, where Victor had delivered a keynote address on youth development systems in emerging football nations. Emilio had kept the program. He had taken notes in the margins. But that wasn't the part that mattered most. What mattered was the passport. My grandfather carried it everywhere, a burgundy document from his country of origin, worn at the edges from decades of use. Inside, it was a visa stamp from 1992, issued for a 6-month technical advisory position with the under-17 national team. The same federation that Emilio Reyes now served had once paid for Victor's flights, his housing, his expertise. The man, Rick Bowman, had just mocked in front of 60 parents, was one of the architects of the program Emilio had spent his career trying to protect. My grandfather reached into his jacket, not quickly, not dramatically. He withdrew the passport and set it on the tablecloth beside his water glass. Emilio saw the color of the cover, the familiar burgundy, and his face shifted into something I didn't yet understand. Rick was still talking. He had moved on to a story about a comeback win from 2 seasons earlier, a story the parents had heard 3 times already. He had no idea what was happening 3 feet to his left. He didn't see Emilio stand for the second time. He didn't see the way my grandfather's hand rested on that passport like it was a key to a door no one else knew existed. And then Emilio cleared his throat, and the room went silent again, but different this time. The kind of silence that happens when an adult enters a room where children have been fighting. Rick turned. Emilio Reyes looked at my grandfather, not at Rick, and said 5 words I have never forgotten. "Victor, I thought that was you." The room didn't understand what it was seeing. Emilio Reyes walked toward our table slowly, the way you approach something you're not sure you're allowed to touch. He stopped in front of my grandfather and extended his hand, not the handshake of a stranger meeting a stranger, but the handshake of a student greeting a teacher he hasn't seen in 20 years. My grandfather took it. He didn't stand. He didn't perform surprise. He nodded once and said, "Emilio, you've done well." Rick Bowman was still holding his butter knife. His grin had frozen into something that looked less like confidence and more like a man who had just felt the floor tilt and wasn't sure if anyone else had noticed. He looked from Emilio to my grandfather and back again, trying to calculate whether this was a problem he could laugh his way out of. "Wait," Rick said, "you two know each other." Emilio turned. He was not smiling. "Coach Bowman, this man is Viktor Dragovic. In 1992, he was brought in by my predecessor to redesign the under-17 national team program. The tactical framework he built produced 12 professional players in 6 years. 2 of them played in the Champions League. I attended a lecture he gave in Zurich in '97. I still have the notes." The silence that followed was not the kind that happens when people are bored. It was the kind that happens when an entire room is recalculating what it thought it knew. Parents who had laughed at Rick's joke 3 minutes earlier were suddenly very interested in their tablecloths. Mothers who had smiled politely were staring at my grandfather with the expression of people who had just realized they'd been sitting next to someone important and had failed to notice. But here's the thing about bullies: they don't stop because the math changes. They stop when they believe the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of backing down. And Rick Bowman hadn't done that calculation yet. He set down the butter knife. He straightened his tie. He looked at Emilio Reyes with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent his entire adult life convincing people he belonged in rooms where he didn't belong. With all due respect, Mr. Reyes, anyone can carry a passport. Anyone can claim a title. I've been coaching in this league for 8 years. I've never heard of Victor anything. It was a gamble, a desperate one. He was betting that Emilio wouldn't have proof, that the story was too convenient, that the room would side with the coach they knew over the old man with the accent they'd been laughing at 30 seconds earlier. It was the kind of move that works often enough that men like Rick keep making it. Emilio reached into his coat pocket and removed his phone. He scrolled for maybe 10 seconds. Then he held up the screen. On it was a photograph, slightly yellowed by time, of a younger Viktor Dragovic standing at a podium in a conference hall. Beside him, holding a plaque, was Emilio Reyes. Both men were 20 years younger. Both men were smiling the smile of professionals who had just finished something important. In the corner of the photograph, handwritten in blue ink, was a date: October 14th, 1997. "I've kept that photograph in my office for 23 years, Emilio said. "Your coach was the man who told me that talent identification begins not with the best players, but with the ones who have the most to lose if they fail. I've built my entire philosophy around that sentence." Rick Bowman had no response. His mouth opened, it closed. The room had shifted beneath him and he was still standing in the same spot, which is not the same thing as standing on solid ground. My grandfather, for his part, had not moved at all. His hand was still resting on the passport. He hadn't looked at Rick since Emilio approached the table. He was watching my father, who was watching him back with an expression I couldn't read. The banquet ended the way things end when they've already ended, but nobody has turned off the lights yet. People finished their chicken. Someone gave a speech about team spirit that everyone forgot before they reached the parking lot. Rick shook a few hands near the exit, but his grip was loose and his eyes kept drifting toward the door like he was waiting for someone to tell him he could leave. Emilio sat with my grandfather for another 20 minutes. They spoke quietly, in a mixture of English and the old language, about people I'd never heard of and tournaments I'd never seen. My father sat beside them, silent, listening. What I didn't know that night, what no one at that banquet could have known, was that the public humiliation of Rick Bowman was not the end of the conflict. It was the beginning of a much uglier one, and it started with something as small and as toxic as a single text message. 3 days after the banquet, my father received a message from Jason Barlow, the assistant coach. It said, word for word, "Rick thinks your father-in-law is running a scam. He's asking the league to look into Victor's background, just a heads up." My father read it 3 times, then he called my grandfather and read it to him. My grandfather listened, said, "I see," and hung up. That night he went to his study, sat down at his desk, and began pulling files from a cabinet he had kept locked for as long as I could remember. The complaint Rick filed with the County Youth League was 8 pages long. I know because my mother obtained a copy of it 3 weeks later from a parent on the league board who had started to feel uncomfortable with where things were headed. The complaint alleged that my grandfather had disrupted a sanctioned team event, had misrepresented his credentials, and had undermined a certified coach in front of players and families. It demanded a formal apology from the Dragovic family, a public retraction of any claims to football expertise, and a review of my continued eligibility on the team. Let me pause here to tell you about how my grandfather actually came to this country, because it changes everything about what happened next. In 1994, 2 years after he finished his contract with the National Federation, Viktor Dragovic was offered the position of technical director for the entire youth program. It was a permanent role with a salary that would have made him one of the highest paid coaches in the country's football system. He had earned it. He had built it from nothing. Every person in the Federation knew he was the right man for the job. But in 1994, my grandfather's country was also sliding into a political crisis that made headlines across Europe. Opposition leaders were being arrested, journalists were disappearing. My grandmother, who had been a columnist for a newspaper that the government didn't approve of, had started receiving threatening phone calls at the house. My mother was 14 years old. My grandfather turned down the job. He liquidated their savings, sold the apartment, and applied for an immigration visa to a country where no one knew his name, where no one cared about his tactical frameworks, where his accent would mark him as foreign and his credentials would mean nothing to most people. He arrived here in 1995 with one suitcase, a wife who was terrified, a daughter who didn't understand why they had left, and a Burgundy passport containing a work visa that represented the biggest professional achievement of his life and the decision to walk away from it. Passport was not just a travel document, it was an archive of everything he had given up. The visa stamp from '92 was still legible. The pages around it were worn from being opened and looked at. My grandfather had carried it to every match he attended, not as a prop, not as a threat, but because he believed that you carry the things that matter. And what mattered to him, what he had never fully explained to any of us, was that he had traded his legacy for his family's safety. The passport was proof that the legacy had existed. Rick Bowman didn't know any of this. The league board didn't know any of this. The parents who had laughed at the banquet didn't know any of this. And as the complaint began its slow crawl through the league's disciplinary process, my grandfather did something I still find remarkable. He didn't call Emilio Reyes. He didn't contact a lawyer. He didn't try to rally parents to his side. He opened that locked cabinet in his study and he began to organize. The files he pulled out contained records I had never seen. Letters from the Federation on official letterhead, all in the old language. A certificate of recognition signed by the president of his country's football association. A photograph of him standing with a group of 19-year-old boys in national team tracksuits, one of whom I recognized from a Bundesliga match I had watched the previous autumn. And at the bottom of the stack, a thin folder containing a handwritten letter in English, dated October 22, 1994, from the Federation's General Secretary. "We understand your decision," it read. "We regret it deeply. Your contribution to our program will not be forgotten." My grandfather spent the better part of a weekend translating these documents, line by line, into English. He didn't trust anyone else to do it. He wanted every word to be precise. When he was finished, he made photocopies of everything, placed them in a manila envelope, and sealed it with tape. Then he called Emilio Reyes, not to ask for help, to ask for the date of the next league board meeting. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in early March at the County Recreation Center. The board consisted of 7 members, most of them parents and former coaches who volunteered their time and had no special training in evaluating international coaching credentials. They were exactly the kind of people who would find 8 pages of a local coach's complaint persuasive, not because the claims were true, but because they were written in English by someone they recognized. They were also exactly the kind of people who would find my grandfather difficult to trust, not because he was lying, but because he spoke with an accent and carried documents in a language they couldn't read. Rick Bowman arrived early. He wore a pressed polo shirt with the club logo on the chest. He shook hands with every board member. He smiled the smile of a man who believed the system was built by and for people exactly like him. My grandfather arrived exactly on time. He was wearing his beige blazer. He was carrying the manila envelope under one arm and the Burgundy passport in the inside pocket of his coat. He did not shake hands with anyone. He sat down in the folding chair designated for the accused, folded his hands on the table, and waited. The chair of the board, a woman named Cheryl who ran a real estate office and had a son in the under-14 division, opened the meeting by reading the complaint aloud. When she finished, she looked at my grandfather over her reading glasses. "Mr. Dragovic," she said, "you've been accused of behavior that violates the league's code of conduct for parents and spectators. How do you respond?" The room was quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed. My grandfather opened the manila envelope, removed the documents, and set them on the table in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Rick Bowman. He looked directly at Cheryl and said, "I'm going to tell you something, and then I'm going to show you proof. And when I am finished, you are going to decide whether the problem in this room is me or the man who filed 8 pages of falsehoods against my family." He reached into his coat and withdrew the passport. And that is when things got worse, because before he could say another word, Rick Bowman leaned forward and spoke into the microphone in front of him. "Cheryl, before we let this man perform for us, I should mention something. The league has received a second complaint from a parent who was at the banquet. She says Victor threatened her son." The room went still. My grandfather's hand paused mid-motion. I had been sitting in the back row next to my father, and I saw something I had never seen on my grandfather's face before. Not anger, not fear, something colder. The expression of a man who has realized that the rules he thought governed the world no longer apply, and that he is standing in a room with someone who will say anything to win. Cheryl blinked. The board members shifted in their chairs. Rick Bowman had just lobbed a grenade into a room that was already running out of oxygen. The accusation that my grandfather had threatened a child was not a new argument. It was a new weapon, and Rick had deployed it in front of 7 people who had no framework for evaluating whether it was true. They only knew that an accusation involving a child was the kind of thing you couldn't ignore without looking like you didn't care about children. My grandfather's hand remained on the passport. He did not look at Rick. He looked at Cheryl and he said, "What child? What parent? If I am accused, I want the name." Cheryl glanced down at her notes. She looked uncomfortable in a way that suggested she had not been prepared for this either. "The parent is a Ms. Deborah Vance. She claims that at the banquet, you approached her son in the hallway near the restrooms and told him in front of witnesses that he should, and I'm quoting here, watch his back. She also says you made a gesture she interpreted as threatening." A murmur moved through the room. My father, seated beside me, went rigid. I could feel the heat coming off him. He was not a man who raised his voice often, but I had seen him angry exactly twice in my life, and both times it had rearranged the furniture of whatever room he was in. My grandfather nodded slowly. "Deborah Vance," he said, "I do not know this woman. I did not speak to any child in the hallway. I did not leave my table during the banquet except to use the restroom once before the toast. I was accompanied by my grandson." He turned and looked at me. "Lucas, you walked with me. Do you remember anyone in the hallway?" I stood up without thinking. I was 15 years old and I had never spoken in a formal meeting in my life. "There was nobody," I said. "We walked to the restroom and back. We passed 2 men near the bar, that's it. No kids, no woman." Rick leaned forward. "Respectfully, Cheryl, the boy is his grandson. Of course he's going to say that. The witness, Ms. Vance, is a neutral party. She has no connection to me or the team. She was at the banquet as a guest of the athletic club. I think that gives her statement more weight." This was a lie constructed with care. Deborah Vance did have a connection to Rick. She was the sister of Rick's former business partner, a man named Gary, who had co-owned a failing indoor training facility with Rick 3 years earlier. The business had collapsed, owing $30,000 to local contractors. Rick had walked away clean because Gary had signed the loans. Gary's sister had been loyal to her brother and had remained friendly with Rick ever since. None of this was in the complaint. None of it would have been known to the board. My grandfather didn't know it yet either, but he would. Cheryl turned to my grandfather. "Mr. Dragovic, we have a sworn statement from a witness. I'm going to ask you directly, did you threaten a child?" "No," my grandfather said, "I did not." "Can you prove that?" It was the wrong question. The burden of proof in disputes like this is supposed to rest with the accuser, but Cheryl had been rattled by the word child and was now asking a 73-year-old man to prove he hadn't done something invisible to disprove. My grandfather understood exactly what was happening. He had lived through a version of this before in the old country, where the accusations didn't start with evidence. They started with someone who wanted you silenced. He opened the passport and removed a small folded document that had been tucked into the back flap. It was a letter, typed on thin paper, written in English. He unfolded it carefully and slid it across the table toward Cheryl. "This is a letter from the General Secretary of my country's football federation, dated 1994. It is a character reference written for my immigration application. I will read you the final paragraph. Viktor Dragovic is a man of unwavering integrity. In 9 years of service to our national youth program, he never once raised his voice in anger at a player, a parent, or a colleague. His methods are patient, his character is beyond reproach, and his contributions to the development of young athletes in our country are immeasurable. The board was quiet. Rick opened his mouth, but my grandfather raised a finger. I am not finished. I have 27 letters from former players, parents, and colleagues. I have a record of every match I attended this season as a spectator, with dates and locations. I have a photograph of the banquet hall showing my table, taken by my daughter-in-law at 7:17 that evening, which proves I was seated from the start of the toast until the end of the meal. The hallway incident Ms. Vance describes allegedly occurred during the toast, according to her statement. I could not have been in two places at once. He slid the photograph across the table. It showed my grandfather, my parents, and me at our table, the empty salad plate still in front of us, the clock on the wall behind us reading 7:17. The timestamp on the photograph from my mother's phone matched her statement. Rick had not anticipated a timestamp. He had not anticipated that my grandfather would come to the meeting with an evidence packet thicker than a novel. He had built his case on the assumption that my grandfather would stammer, get emotional, and make a bad impression. He had bet on the accent. He had lost. Cheryl looked at the photograph, then at Rick. Coach Bowman, this photograph seems to contradict your witness's timeline. Rick didn't flinch. Men like him don't flinch when the evidence turns. They pivot. The timeline could be off by a few minutes. That doesn't mean the incident didn't happen. And I'd ask the board to consider something else. If Mr. Dragovic is who he claims to be, if he has this incredible background in international football, why is he here? Why isn't he still in his home country coaching at the highest level? Why would a man of his supposed accomplishments abandon his career and move to a small town in a country where no one knows his name? The question landed not because it was fair, but because it gave the board a new place to put their doubt. People who don't know the answer to a question will sometimes treat the existence of the question as evidence. My grandfather closed the passport. He looked at Rick for the first time since entering the room. I left because people in my country were being arrested for writing things the government did not like, he said. My wife was a journalist. She received threats. I chose my family over my career. I came here so my daughter could grow up safe. I came here so my grandson could play football without anyone caring about his name or his politics. I did not come here to be called a liar by a man who mocks accents and files false accusations to cover his own embarrassment. The room was stone silent. Rick's face did something complicated. The smirk was gone. In its place was the expression of a man who has just realized he has publicly accused a political refugee of being a fraud and that the room has started to understand it. Then Emilio Reyes stood up from the back row where he had been sitting unnoticed. Cheryl, if I may address the board. Cheryl looked relieved to have the attention shifted anywhere else. Mr. Reyes, of course. Emilio walked to the front of the room. He was holding a folder of his own, a thick one with the Federation's logo on the front. I reached out to the national office this week. I asked them to pull whatever they had on Viktor Dragovic, and I want to read you what they sent me. He opened the folder and began reading from a fax document. Viktor Dragovic served as technical consultant to the under-17 national team from 1987 to 1994. During his tenure, the team achieved its highest-ever finish in continental championship competition. 12 players developed under his guidance went on to sign professional contracts in Europe. 2 were capped at the senior international level. His tactical manual remains a reference text in the Federation's coaching education program. He is considered one of the most influential youth development specialists in the modern history of our football system. Emilio closed the folder. This isn't from me. This is from the National Federation, the same federation that works with FIFA, UEFA, and the International Olympic Committee. If this board rules against Viktor Dragovic based on the word of a disgruntled coach and a witness who can't get her timeline straight, I will personally ensure that every youth league in this country knows about it. And I will let the national office know that their former technical consultant was treated as a liar by a volunteer board that couldn't be bothered to verify a single document he provided. The board members were not accustomed to being threatened with international embarrassment. They were accustomed to deciding whether uniforms needed replacing and what to do about the broken sprinkler on Field 3. They looked at Cheryl. Cheryl looked at Rick. Rick looked at the door, and for one brief moment, I saw a man who understood he was about to lose everything. But here's what I didn't understand yet. Here's what no one in that room understood. Rick Bowman was not done. He had one more move, and it was the ugliest one of all. He stood up. He straightened his polo shirt. He looked at Cheryl with the expression of a man who had accepted defeat and was about to be gracious about it. "Cheryl," he said, "I want to withdraw my complaint. I think this has gotten out of hand. I clearly misjudged the situation. I apologize to Mr. Dragovic for any misunderstanding. I think we should all go home." It was a retreat. It sounded like a retreat. It felt like the end of the conflict. Cheryl looked relieved. The board members began gathering their papers. My grandfather did not look relieved. He was watching Rick with the expression of a man who had seen predators retreat before and knew that they never went far. He was right. Because the next morning my father's phone rang at 6:45. It was Jason Barlow again, the assistant coach, and this time his voice was different. "Dan," he said, "Rick's filing a complaint with the county, not the league. The County Youth Sports Commission. He's saying Victor assaulted a parent at the banquet. He's got a witness who's willing to testify. I'm sorry, he's not stopping." My father set down the phone. My mother came into the kitchen and saw his face and asked what was wrong. He told her. She sat down at the table and put her head in her hands. My grandfather was in the next room. He had heard the phone ring. He had heard my father's voice. He came into the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down across from my mother and said, "Tell me everything." And that is how I learned what a man who has faced down worse than Rick Bowman does when the fight doesn't end. He doesn't get louder. He gets more prepared. He doesn't run. He waits. And then he moves. The County Youth Sports Commission was not a volunteer board of parents. It was a formal body with legal authority to suspend coaches, ban spectators, and permanently revoke participation rights. A complaint filed, there was not a disagreement about team policy. It was the beginning of a legal proceeding that could follow my grandfather for years. Rick had escalated the fight to a level where the cost of losing was no longer embarrassment. It was official sanction. My grandfather spent the next 3 days on the phone with Emilio Reyes and a lawyer named Peter Kovac, a friend from the old country who practiced immigration and civil law 2 towns over. Peter was a compact man with glasses and a mustache who spoke 5 languages and had once represented a diplomat in an extradition hearing. He listened to my grandfather's account and said, "Victor, I need you to understand something. This man is accusing you of assault. Even if you win, the accusation itself can cause damage. The commission will investigate. They will interview people. They will look at your immigration status. Are you prepared for that?" My grandfather paused. He looked at Peter. "I have been investigated before," he said. "In my own country before I left, they came to my house. They went through my papers. They interviewed my wife's colleagues. They found nothing. This man, this Rick, he does not know what I have already survived. He thinks I am a weak old man with an accent. He is wrong." Peter nodded. "Then we fight." But the fight moved faster than anyone expected. 4 days after the county complaint was filed, a reporter from the local newspaper called my parents' house. She was working on a story about conflict in youth sports and had heard about the complaint. She wanted comment. My father told her no comment and hung up. The next morning, a brief item appeared in the community section of the paper. Youth coach alleges assault by spectator at end-of-season banquet. It didn't name my grandfather, but it named the team, and in a town the size of Greenfield, that was the same thing. Parents who had been at the banquet started calling each other. Half of them had seen the confrontation and knew Rick was lying. The other half hadn't seen anything but trusted the coach because they had trusted him for years. The team began to split down the middle. My phone buzzed with texts from teammates. Some asked if my grandfather was okay. One, a boy named Derek, whose father was Rick's closest friend on the coaching staff, texted, "My dad says your grandpa should just apologize and this will all go away." I didn't respond. And then Deborah Vance, changed her story. Emilio Reyes had spent the week investigating quietly. He had called contacts at the athletic club, people who had been working the night of the banquet. He found a bartender who remembered seeing my grandfather and me walk to the restroom. He found a club manager who had security camera footage from the hallway, footage that showed no confrontation, no child, no Deborah Vance. The footage was time-stamped and continuous. It proved that the alleged incident could not have occurred when Ms. Vance claimed it had. But that's not what changed her story. What changed it was the phone call Emilio placed to Gary Boyd, Deborah's brother and Rick's former business partner. Emilio had done his homework on the failed training facility, on the unpaid contractors, on the pattern of Rick walking away from obligations. He told Gary that if his sister was willing to commit perjury in a county commission hearing, that if she was willing to lie under oath to destroy an old man's reputation, then Emilio would make sure the commission knew exactly who had put her up to it and why. He told Gary about the $30,000. He told Gary about the bartender. He told Gary about the security footage. And then he said something that I think about often: your sister doesn't need to go down with him. She just needs to tell the truth. Gary called his sister. Deborah Vance called the commission the next morning and withdrew her statement. She didn't admit to lying on the record, but she said she was no longer willing to participate in the proceeding. Without her statement, Rick's assault complaint collapsed. The commission informed Peter Kovac that the case was being dismissed pending review, which is what official bodies do when they want to close something without admitting they opened it wrong. I thought that was the end. I was 15. I hadn't learned yet that people like Rick Bowman don't just lose and go away. They lose and they wait. And what Rick was waiting for was the final board meeting of the season, scheduled for the last week of April, where the league was going to vote on coaching assignments for the following year. Rick's contract was up for renewal. And my grandfather, who had spent 4 months being accused of lies, then threats, then assault, had decided that the vote would not be a formality. He had documents. He had the business records from the failed training facility. He had statements from 2 contractors who were still owed money. He had a letter from Deborah Vance's attorney confirming her withdrawal from the commission case. He had the original complaint with its false timeline. He had the security footage from the athletic club. And he had a burgundy passport that contained the record of a life Rick Bowman had dismissed as an accent and a funny way of talking. On the morning of the vote, my grandfather put on his beige blazer. He placed the documents in his leather briefcase. He looked at me across the breakfast table and said, "Lucas, I have spent my life building things, teams, systems, reputations. I have never in my life tried to destroy something, but I have learned that there is a difference between destruction and accountability. Today, I'm not going to destroy your coach. I am going to make him accountable. And I want you to understand the difference." I didn't fully understand, but I nodded, and I followed him out the door. The league board met in the same recreation center conference room, but the air was different. The board members were the same 7 volunteers, but they sat up straighter. Cheryl was at the head of the table, her reading glasses perched on her nose, a stack of manila folders in front of her. Rick Bowman arrived early again, but this time he didn't work the room. He sat alone at the end of a folding table near the wall, scrolling through his phone with the expression of a man who had convinced himself the worst was over. He was wrong. My grandfather took a seat in the front row of the audience chairs, the leather briefcase on his lap. He didn't open it yet. He was waiting. The first 30 minutes of the meeting were administrative, minutes from the previous session, a report on field maintenance, a budget request for new goal nets. Anyone who didn't know better would have thought it was a routine gathering, but the room was too quiet during the budget discussion. Too many people kept glancing toward my grandfather, or toward Rick, or toward the empty chair where Deborah Vance was supposed to be. Cheryl eventually closed her binder and cleared her throat. The next item on the agenda is coaching assignments for the fall season. As you all know, Coach Bowman's contract is up for renewal. We've received his application, along with 3 other candidates for the under-15 division. Before we discuss, the floor is open for public comment. My grandfather stood. He didn't hurry. He walked to the front of the room, set his briefcase on the table, and opened it. He removed a folder, then another, then a third. He lined them up in a neat row. Then he turned to face the board. His voice was quiet, the accent still there, but every word landed like a stone dropping into still water. My name is Viktor Dragovic. I am here as a spectator, a grandfather, and a member of this community. I am not here to ask you to renew or dismiss anyone. I am here to give you information that I believe this board should have before it makes its decision. He opened the first folder. This is a record of a business called Strike Zone Indoor Training, co-owned by Richard Bowman and Gary Boyd from 2016 to 2018. The business declared bankruptcy in December of 2018. It left $31,000 in unpaid debts to 5 local contractors. 2 of those contractors are parents in this league. They were never paid. This board should know that the coach it is considering for renewal walked away from $31,000 of debt and let his business partner absorb the consequences. Rick stood up. This is ridiculous. That has nothing to do with coaching. Cheryl raised a hand. Coach Bowman, you'll have an opportunity to respond. Mr. Dragovic, please continue. My grandfather opened the second folder. This is a copy of the complaint filed with the County Youth Sports Commission dated March 22nd, in which Mr. Bowman alleged that I assaulted a parent at the end-of-season banquet. The complaint was dismissed on April 7th. The witness, Deborah Vance, withdrew her statement. This folder contains her withdrawal letter, a sworn statement from the athletic club manager, and a copy of the security footage showing the hallway where the incident allegedly occurred. The footage is continuous. It shows no assault. It shows no Deborah Vance. It shows no child. He slid a USB drive across the table. The footage is on this drive. I invite the board to watch it. I also invite the board to consider that a coach who files a false assault complaint against a 73-year-old spectator based on a witness who later withdraws may not be the kind of coach this league wants representing it. The room was completely silent. Rick's face had gone pale. He was still standing, but his hands were gripping the edge of the table. He looked at Cheryl. Cheryl was not looking back at him. My grandfather opened the third folder. This is the original complaint Mr. Bowman filed with the league board in February, alleging that I disrupted a team event and misrepresented my credentials. This folder contains 27 letters of reference. It contains my employment contract with my country's national federation, translated and notarized. It contains a photograph of me with 12 players who went on to professional careers. It contains a letter from the General Secretary of the Federation, dated 1994, confirming my position and my contributions. And it contains this. He reached into his coat and withdrew the passport. He didn't open it this time. He just held it up so the board could see the burgundy cover. This passport contains a visa stamp from 1992. It is the visa that allowed me to serve as technical consultant to the under-17 national team. I have carried it for 27 years, not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, because it reminds me of what I left behind and why. I left a career, a reputation, and a country because my wife was threatened and because I believed my family would be safer here. Mr. Bowman saw an old man with an accent and decided I was nothing. He was wrong. But the question before this board today is not whether Mr. Bowman was wrong about me. The question is whether this league wants to place its children in the care of a man who responds to embarrassment with lies, who escalates disputes into false accusations, and who leaves debts unpaid while demanding loyalty from families who trust him with their sons. He closed the briefcase. He looked at the board, not at Rick. I have said what I came to say. I trust this board to make its decision with the full information that Mr. Bowman did not want you to have. He walked back to his seat. He sat down. He folded his hands in his lap. He did not look at Rick. He did not look at me. He looked straight ahead, the same way he had stood on the sideline at every match, watching quietly, taking notes. Cheryl removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. Coach Bowman, do you wish to respond? Rick stood. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he said, I withdraw my application for renewal. He picked up his phone and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click. That was the last time I ever saw Rick Bowman. The board voted unanimously to accept the withdrawal, and to place a formal notation in the league records regarding the false complaint. The notation meant that if Rick ever applied for a coaching position in any other county league, the receiving board would see it. It was not a ban, but it was the end of his credibility. For a man who had built his entire identity on being the coach, it was worse than a ban. The aftermath of that meeting was quiet, the way things are quiet after a storm when you're still standing in the place where the wind was. Parents filtered out of the room in small clusters. A few of them approached my grandfather and said things they should have said months earlier. One father, a man named Tim whose son played midfield, shook my grandfather's hand and said, "I laughed at that joke at the banquet. I didn't know, I'm sorry." My grandfather nodded and said, "You know now, that is enough." Emilio Reyes was the last to leave. He stood with my grandfather near the exit, and they spoke for several minutes in the old language. My grandfather's voice was softer when he spoke that language, less guarded. I couldn't understand most of what they said, but I caught one word that I recognized: legacy. Emilio nodded and put his hand on my grandfather's shoulder. Then he turned to me and said, "Your grandfather doesn't like to talk about what he built, so I will tell you. The Federation has decided to name its annual Youth Coaching Award after him, the Dragovic Award. It will be given for the first time next spring. The announcement will be made at a ceremony in the capital. They want him there." My grandfather looked at the floor. He shook his head slightly, not in denial, but in the way men shake their heads when something is too large to fit inside words. Emilio smiled and said, "I told them he would say no. I also told them I would make him say yes. We'll see which of us wins." My father drove us home. The car was silent for the first 10 minutes. Then my father said, "Dad, I should have stood up at the banquet. I should have said something before it ever got to that boardroom. I'm sorry." My grandfather was in the passenger seat. He turned and looked at my father. "Daniel, you are my son. You were in an impossible position. You had a wife and a child and a team that your son loved. You were trying to hold everything together. I never needed you to fight my battles. I needed you to be the man you are, and you are, so let this go." My father's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't say anything else, but I saw him wipe his eyes once, quickly, the way men do when they want to pretend it didn't happen. That night I found my grandfather in his study. He was sitting at his desk, the passport open in front of him. He wasn't looking at the visa page this time. He was looking at something tucked into the back flap, something I had never seen before. It was a small, folded photograph, worn at the edges, black and white. It showed a teenage boy in a football kit, holding a trophy, grinning. On the back, in blue ink that had faded over decades, was a handwritten note. My grandfather saw me looking and handed me the photograph. "Do you know who that is?" he asked. I looked at the boy's face. I had seen it before, on television, older and more famous. "Is that him?" I said, "the one who played in the World Cup?" My grandfather nodded. He was 14 when I first coached him. He couldn't afford boots his own size. I bought him a pair. He wrote me that note the day he was called up to the senior national team. "To the man who saw something in me before I saw it in myself." I have carried it for 31 years. When I left the country, it was the one photograph I could not leave behind. He took the photograph back and looked at it for a long moment. Then he slipped it into the passport and closed the cover. "I did not build a career for applause, Lucas. I built it for boys like him. And when I left, I thought I had lost that part of myself forever. But I didn't lose it. It was in here the whole time." He tapped the passport. "And last week, Emilio told me that 3 of the boys in that old photograph are now coaching youth academies themselves. One of them is using my tactical manual. He translated it into 3 languages. He sends it to every new coach in his program." He looked at me. "Do you understand what I'm telling you? I thought I had walked away from my legacy. But a legacy is not a job. It is not a title. It is what keeps growing after you think you've planted your last seed. It is what happens when the boys you taught become teachers. When the system you built becomes the system that builds others. When a passport that you carried across an ocean, thinking it was only a memory, turns out to be a living thing that you never really left behind." I stayed in that study for another hour. He told me stories I had never heard about the boys he had coached, the matches he had watched from the sideline in stadiums I'd only seen on television, the letters that still arrived at our house in their old language, letters from men who were now fathers and coaches and executives, all of them writing to the man who had seen something in them first. And I realized that the whole story, the banquet and the complaint, and the board hearing and the vindication was only the smallest part of what my grandfather had been carrying. The real story was bigger and quieter, and had been unfolding for decades in the background of every match he attended, every note he wrote in that leather-bound book, every moment he stood on a sideline with his arms folded, watching. A few weeks later, the new coach was announced. It was a man named Tomás Herrera, a former college player who had just moved to the area with his young family. He was quiet and methodical and spent his first practice teaching positioning instead of running sprints. My grandfather attended the first match of the fall season. He stood in his usual spot, arms folded, making notes. After the match, Tomás walked over and introduced himself. He said, "Sir, I've read your manual. I studied it in my certification course. I can't believe you're here." My grandfather shook his hand and said, "You have a good system. The left back is drifting too central. Talk to him about it. He will listen." Tomás nodded and wrote it down. And that was how things changed. Not with a parade, not with a headline, but with a new coach who knew my grandfather's name, and a league that had learned a lesson about who it trusted, and a team that kept playing football every Saturday morning, and an old man in a beige blazer who stood on the sideline and watched his grandson run across a field that was, in its own small way, the same field he had been standing on his entire life. That season, our team finished second in the league. Tomás Herrera didn't shout on the sideline. He coached the way my grandfather had taught, the way the manual described: build the foundation, trust the structure, and the results will follow. My grandfather attended every match. He still stood with his arms folded. He still made small notes in that leather-bound book. But now, when parents saw him, they didn't see an old man with an accent. They saw the man whose name would soon be on an award handed out in a ceremony across the ocean. It's strange how quickly the same people who once laughed now wanted their sons to shake his hand. I think about that banquet often, not the humiliation. That part fades. What stays with me is the moment before Emilio Reyes stood up, when my grandfather could have done anything, shouted, left, lowered his head. Instead, he set his fork down. He smiled. He waited. He knew what was in his pocket, and he knew that the truth doesn't need to shout if it's already standing in the room. The coach had made a bet that everyone at that dinner would see only the surface. He lost. But the bigger question, the one that lingers, is how many other people we all pass every day, dismissing them because of how they speak or where they come from, while they carry something extraordinary just beneath the surface. My grandfather once told me that talent identification, real identification, isn't about finding the best players. It's about finding the ones with the most to lose if they fail. He was talking about football, but I think he was also talking about life. We overlook people because it's easier than looking twice. We laugh at jokes we shouldn't laugh at because it's easier than standing up. And when someone finally shows us what we missed, we are surprised, as if the fault was theirs for not being obvious enough. But they were obvious. He was obvious. The passport was in his pocket the entire time. The legacy was there, in the letters, in the photographs, in the boys he'd coached who were now men leading academies of their own. The only thing missing was our willingness to see it, and that's on us. A few months after the season ended, my grandfather received a letter from the Federation in his home country. It was thick, official, stamped with the Federation seal. He read it at the kitchen table, and when he finished, he set it down and looked out the window at the oak tree in our backyard. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They want me to come back for the ceremony. They want me to give a speech." He paused. "I have not given a speech in 30 years. I am not sure I remember how, but he was smiling when he said it. He will go, I know he will. And when he stands at that podium, in front of coaches and players and Federation officials who know his name, he will probably wear the same beige blazer. He will probably speak in that same quiet voice, the accent still there, because it was never something to erase. And he will tell them what he told me, that a legacy is not what you keep, it's what you give away that keeps growing after you're gone. If this story reached you, if you understood why that moment mattered, then you already know that the best things are often hidden in plain sight. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you soon.